A senator is proposing a bill in Florida to ban any political party who has supported or still supports any kind of slavery. Now, in Florida, we know that they're trying to fight the people who are on the left, and we have two big fires that are they're combating each other at the moment. So you have the people on the left, and you have the people on the right, and they're trying to use different authoritarian means to combat what's happening in culture. Now, why is this bill unconstitutional? Well, it's unconstitutional because people have a right to freely assemble, freely associate, and whether or not that's for good or bad, it doesn't matter. The Constitution protects those parties, those people, because anything can be exploited by centralized authority. Now, when we look at what Florida is doing, why are they saying that they're trying to ban any political party who has supported slavery in the past? They're digging at Democrats because Democrats were the party of slavery. And a lot of our education, or rather our school system, they teach us that slavery came from Republicans. This is not true. Abraham Lincoln himself was a Republican. In fact, he was one of the first Republicans at the time because it had transitioned after the Whig Party. Political parties change all the time, but there have always been these two parallels of parties. And at the time, it wasn't the North versus the South. That's the common phrasing that we hear, but it was Democrats versus Republicans. The Republicans were around the country, and you had Democrats in the North and the South, but they were part of the slave states. They were the states who wanted slavery, and you had Republicans who weren't necessarily fighting to stop slavery altogether in the sense of diminishing slavery, because they knew that it was tied to the economy, but they wanted to stop expanding slavery. So that was the situation in the 1860s. Now, I understand where the people of Florida are coming from because they see how the left has taken over all of these institutions and they have bad motives, bad intentions, but they cover it up, they sprinkle it up with good intentions or a positive emotional appeal towards the demographic. But this is not the answer. The answer is not to be authoritarian and to overstep the Constitution. The Constitution is a necessity if we're going to hold on to our American values, our ethics, our morality. Instead, we have to fight the front on culture. Culture is really what matters. Now, we have two sides, the right, the left, and we can talk about the uniparty and the establishment and how it really doesn't matter which party you're on, but let's use our value system, okay? So it's not necessarily Republican or Democrat, it's more about our value system. Now, we have the left who uses an ethical appeal and an emotional appeal. We have the right who uses an ethical appeal and a logical appeal. So we have largely ethical appeals, but one is using emotion, one is using logic. Now, the logical side, it entices people to use their cognitive function, to use their critical thinking. And the left uses people's primitive thinking, their reactionary thinking. Now, which side is going to win out the majority of the time? Well, the side where it resonates with our evolutionary biology. For the longest period of time, we've been emotional creatures. Even now when we make decisions, even if it's a very logical, objective decision, we're using emotions to justify using a logical decision. So to paint an example, we may really want to eat ice cream because at a primitive level, sugars and fats satisfy our biological need of preserving energy in case we don't have energy in the future, in case we face famine in the future. So we may justify to ourselves and use a logical approach of, okay, well, I'll run 1 mile and that'll justify my action of eating that ice cream cone. So that's a very simple example, but you can scale it to bigger endeavors. Now, the left has done a very good job at using an emotional appeal towards the people because they understand human psychology. They understand if they can emotionally tie their belief systems to people's minds, well, they pretty much have them. And they can use, well, there are many different emotions they use, but the major emotion they use is fear. Fear is a great motivator. When they use fear, the left uses fear, that stimulates an emotional reaction of, I want to preserve my security, also known as I want to preserve my survival, and I'm willing to relinquish whatever liberties I have to a centralized authority, to the state, so that they can secure my survival and I will be alive. I will see another day, I will continue, I will reproduce, I will allow my genes to spread onto the next generation. That is everyone's inherent biological imperative. When we look at the right will use a logical appeal. They'll say, well, we can't do this action because of X, Y, and Z, and here are the motives, and here's what we need to look at, and these are the logical steps to get to A to B. And that resonates with people from a cognitive prefrontal basis, but it doesn't stimulate an emotional reaction, which is much stronger as we've already established in making decisions, it is much stronger to do an emotional appeal than it is for a logical appeal. So even though the majority of humans have the ability to use their prefrontal cortex, that is a more recent development than our amygdala or our hippocampus, for example. So our hippocampus, that's mainly memory storage. Amygdala is like fight or flight, so response systems. And if you see a lizard, for example, and you commit some kind of quick action next to the lizard, a lizard is more primitive in its reaction. So it'll scurry, but maybe only 2 or 3 feet away. It won't completely run away. It'll just scurry 2 or 3 feet away from what its emotional response is of getting away from danger, potential danger. It's not really using a cognitive function because they don't have the same or similar systems as we do as humans or as primates in general, mammals in general, of being able to establish slow, non-reactive judgment. That is a drastic difference that we as humans, Homo sapiens, have that is much different than any other species in existence. And so we have to establish that, yes, it's much better to use logos, but to capture people's minds and people's hearts, you have to take emotion and you also have to tie it in with storytelling. We've also evolved with storytelling. Us being able to write and read and pass down recollections to the next generation, that has only been, the written record has only been in existence for a small period of time compared to us verbally relaying stories to our children and our descendants. And so we would take our stories of us facing a tiger or potential danger of us falling off that cliff, which is a scarring memory in our minds for us to remember, and then we would tell that compelling story either to create caution with others that we care about, or to create some type of hope or strategy for the future so that they could be more successful in their biological reproduction. So storytelling plus emotion, you really have someone's head at that point. Whereas a logical appeal is more, you're even-keeled, you're objective, you're being neutral, you're establishing everything from a non-biased point of view. We already know, even when we're looking at news, even when we're looking at these people who are, let's say, anchors on different television shows, they're using their own bias, because that is the type of emotional leaning that they're using with their experiences, their worldview, their perspective, their belief system, and they're portraying it to you. And now a bias isn't necessarily bad if it's for, let's use individual rights. Having a bias towards individual rights is not necessarily bad. Now, it depends what your goal is. If you're an authoritarian, fascistic, communistic leader, that's going against your goals as that leader, because you don't really want to give individual rights to people, because that gives more power to people. You want to give more power to a centralized authority, which you are a part of. If you're someone who sees the value of a democratic system, you want people to be, you want to take the power and you want to distribute it amongst the people so that they have some power against an authority figure or a centralized authority who could exploit or leverage power over the general population. So if we're being the most empathetic, right? Empathy doesn't mean having pity or sympathy for someone or feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is a very objective term. All it means is that we are placing ourselves, if we're doing a type of, you could do this visually, but also just a mental representation, a mental model of being in someone else's shoes. And when you're in those person's shoes, how would you want to be treated? What would you want to have access to? And then you would apply that to every private citizen. So that's how we get individual rights. And a lot of people can use the claim of, oh, well, the state gives you individual rights. That's one perspective. Another perspective is, this is by God. God had given you individual rights that you have inherited it. Okay, that's another perspective. But if we want to tie into the root cause, the root core of why we have individual rights, people are empathetic. I don't want my free speech infringed on. I want to have a fair trial by a jury of my peers. I don't want my personal effects to be searched and seized unlawfully by the centralized authority that runs our lives. And therefore, I'm going to take those rights that I want and apply it to you as well, because we're both private citizens. That is empathy. So it's a very objective, sanitized way of viewing the world from a person-to-person perspective. So how we view these biases, it's all dependent on our goals, but hopefully we want the goal of advancing civilization, ensuring that people have their own rights, their own power in a way with individual rights. And that is really a new phenomenon, because for the longest period of time, sure, we had hierarchies, but most people did not have individual rights. Even if you were in a tribe of 200 people, of course, you're going to have more power distributed compared to if you have a country of like 50 million people. But even then, in tribes, they could be very abusive in terms of power. The higher up you go in the hierarchy, it just depends on which civilization you're in, like the Aztecs versus the Europeans. These are two totally different civilizations who would distribute power in different facets of their societies. But the more and more we go on, now we're the same, pretty much the same creatures as we were 100,000 years ago. We just have better technology. We can learn quicker. We can adapt quicker. Obviously, well, I guess it's not obvious to most people, but the sexual selection of humans gets better and better over time because you have women who are picking the top tier men. So on average, you only have 40 to 60% of men every generation who actually reproduce versus over 80% of women who reproduce. So by default, by natural selection, women are picking the best men. Over time, that creates a better species. It is a zero-sum game in terms of there are going to be some males who don't reproduce at all, and you're going to have some females in there who don't reproduce at all as well. But you're creating a species naturally of whatever is relevant at the time. That could be competency, that could be height, that could be muscle mass, it could be intelligence. Typically, it's all a power game of whatever's valued in the hierarchy. Almost every species values a hierarchy. That's how you achieve. That's how you achieve things in this world. Humans are based off of hierarchy, so we care about power, status, resources. That may not change until we evolve into another species, but we'll still be tied to that hierarchy in some way, unless we just totally develop in a different direction. So that's how we need to approach these biases. Going back to the Constitution, we need to value the Constitution at every level. Even if you have woke culture, cancel culture, whatever it is, we need to make sure that, yes, we are changing these institutions, but by culture, by influencing people in a positive way of, hey, they're emotionally manipulating you. You could use some emotion too. The right could use some emotion, but you need to make sure you're using the proper emotion that will stimulate people and then tie it into your belief system. We could take the debate of abortion, for example, and you could have two emotional debates. And if people have empathy, they have the understanding, and they're both getting the same person is getting the emotional appeal from both sides instead of an emotional appeal from one side and a logical appeal from the other side. They're getting an emotional appeal from both. They're more likely to see, oh yeah, now I understand. I have more empathy for the position where we should value human life. This is something that we value. I'm a human, I'm alive, and so I want to value other human lives. I'm not saying everyone is going to be okay with it, but there is more of a guarantee when the right is also using an emotional appeal to further their agenda when it comes to the cultural agenda. Right now, we're seeing the society degrade quicker and quicker because the left has control over the cultural agenda, and they're using a distorted emotional appeal. Well, they're using an emotional appeal tied into their distorted ideology, and that really screws everything up. And over time, you'll have a society that breaks down, and another civilization, like people from the East in Asia, they'll come over because they'll see a vulnerable society, and they'll take over. And they won't value individual rights as much as we do right now. And so everything that's happening in society, the degradation of culture, the degradation of sexual dynamics, the decline of individual rights, all this will get even worse when another civilization comes in who doesn't value individual rights and takes over. That now becomes a biggest threat to our existence right now.